I'm really curious about the dupability of large segments of our society to sign up for what looks like on the very outside, no mask, cruelty, hatred, us versus them. And what can we say about a population that looks at that and says, yeah, I'm in with that. I'm okay with that.
Well, I used to be very mad at Germany because they went along with Hitler, and 6 million Jews were killed as a result of that. And I kept wondering, why didn't they do something? And I think when people are hurting, they're more gullible. They're more likely to follow someone who has some kind of charisma, or also they can identify with the wound of the person who's leading. And once they have a wound identification, it's like, oh, you really get me. You really understand me. Then they're willing to do anything for that person. It's a very addictive system, and it's very codependent.
Welcome to the Wellness Warrior channel, Myth, Magic, and Medicine podcast. I'm your host, Dan Gorbino. With me, Dr. Michael Obsatz. Continuing our discussion on unity versus empire consciousness. We're diving in today very important topics around abandonment and trust. And we'll get into some other issues as well.
I'm Mike Obsatz, Professor Emeritus, Macalester College, St. Paul. I taught there for close to 40 years, and I'm a workshop leader. I've done workshops all over the country and written 3 books, one on raising nonviolent children in a violent world, which won the Minnesota Book Award in 1999, as well as done a lot of men's work, men's groups, led couples groups, and I've written about 150 articles and had about 30 podcasts of various kinds on lifesjourney.us is one way to connect with me. So we're going to talk about, where should we start? Should we start with abandonment?
Yeah, what came up in our last conversations was issues around trust. And then that triggered a flagging of this conversation for deeper exploration around that and how trust gets broken.
So trust is the most important thing. And the things that you have to trust in life are specific people that will care for you and accept you for who you are. Trust that everything will be okay and you'll get what you need. And trust that you can be your authentic self and know that you're lovable, loved, and loving. That's what trust involves. And if you don't have that, there's a reason for it. I believe everybody is trying to be their authentic self, but they've been limited in certain ways by certain situations. One is their family. Another is the culture we live in, which has what I call empire consciousness. And also this whole idea that the most important thing to do is rise to the top and fit in somehow. And when you have to fit in, you have to fit into whatever dysfunctional situation you're in. So you have to become not yourself and dysfunctional. And that's what happens to a lot of people. So abandonment is not just emotionally being abandoned or physically being abandoned. It has to do with the idea that you are not good enough as you are. You have to conform to what other people want you to be. And if you don't do that, you're unworthy. But you can never be totally worthy because you never know if you're safe. My first psychology teacher was Abraham Maslow, and he said the very first need people have is safety. So in an empire situation with a consciousness and behaviors such as power, hierarchy, domination, oppression, and control, no one is safe, not even the people at the top. So when no one is safe, you can't learn to trust. So the challenge is to move out of that level of consciousness and then out of that kind of behavior. You can't solve it just by mandating it or making it legal or somehow having a law about it. It has to be an inside job. It has to come from oneself. So what a person has to do is say to themselves, yes, I was abandoned, but it was never about me. This was happening to me, around me, but never was about me because I'm still loved, lovable, and loving. And that is the unity or oneness consciousness that I talk about, is knowing that so deeply in your soul and in your heart inside you that you don't have to conform to what other people think you should be. So along with abandonment by the culture and by competition and power and domination and families where you're not allowed to express your full self comes self-abandonment. You then don't know who you are and you abandon yourself. And one of the things that goes on is shame. I'm not enough. I'm worthless. I can never be enough. I can never do enough. And the worthlessness feeling is the ultimate abandonment. So shame is the ultimate abandonment. It's the result of ultimately not loving yourself. So the solution to that is to return to your inner being, know your lovability, and then you can't let the world tell you who you are. So there's all kinds of definitions of what a man is supposed to be, for example. So if a man is supposed to be tough and strong and in control, all that was made up. I mean, yeah, men have certain hormones, but they can modify what they do or feel to being compassionate, loving, considerate, cooperative, sharing, and that doesn't make them any less a man. But we culturally don't define it that way. There's always winners and losers. Even in athletics, there's always winners and losers, and the winners are happy and the losers are sad. And it's like, so this whole idea that you have to be a winner means you have to get to the top, which there is no top, according to Robert Bly, among other authors. So all of this relates to Erik Erikson's first stage of trust versus mistrust. And he said early on, that is the core issue, which produces all functional behavior and all dysfunctional behavior. You don't trust yourself. You don't trust the process. Now, here's the thing. You have to selectively trust. So you don't just trust anybody. They have to prove that they're trustworthy for you to trust them. But as far as trusting yourself, you go inside and you go, okay, I am spiritually connected. I am loved, lovable, and loving. That's what I trust. I am not perfect, but I am those things. So trust is related to the outside world, but it's also related to the inside world. One of the ways you would trust in a healthy way is that you would have self-compassion. You would use selective vulnerability, which means you would be vulnerable, but only in places where you are safe enough to be vulnerable, which is the whole purpose of support groups that we started. We had to create safe places for people to be who they are, because the world itself will not accept you for who you really are. The New Testament, there, Jesus says, be in the world, but not of the world. And that, what he simply means is you have to function and navigate yourself in a world that isn't necessarily going to validate and support who you really are. Because the world is at a level of shallow empire consciousness, which is, what can you do for me? How much money can I make from this? How can I use you? You know, we can talk about how this relates to immigrants right now, because immigrants have been used to produce the crops for centuries, and they've been undervalued for who they are. But we take for granted that some people are worth something and other people are not worth something, which is where trust comes in. Because how can you trust anybody if they don't think you're worth anything? So self-worth and abandonment and shame are all part of this process of really connecting. Now, for some people, they add the spiritual part, which is God or spirit or higher power, and that is their perfect parent or their perfect environment where they're totally loved for who they are. And if you need to get that from the outside world, you can get it spiritually. You can also get it by finding the people who support and love you for who you really are. And who you really are will change over time. So there's an adjustment process that goes on. Who I am at 83 is different than who I am at 7. And having gone through extensive bullying, it's amazing that I can trust anybody at this point. And by extensive bullying for 7 years means I never felt safe anywhere. And I think one of the cultural norms, things going on right now in the culture, is people aren't feeling safe again, which is bringing up not only the current situation, but whatever in the past made them feel unsafe. So safety and trust are really intertwined like that. Well, I think when you know what you feel, but you're hiding it, that's a sign. If you're severely depressed, by the way, the losses involved in not being authentic include you're not allowed to feel what you feel. You're not allowed to show your feelings. When you start noticing that you're doing that, or you have to pretend to be something you're not, or you have to go along with something that you don't believe in. Whenever you lose a part of yourself, it's a sign that you're living out your abandonment stuff. Depression, anger, it's a grief, a loss. It's a grieving process of the loss of your authentic wholeness. The Gifts of Imperfection by Brene Brown talks about the actual imperfections that you have, quote, are gifts. So everything is a gift. Life is a gift. Every day is a gift. Breathing is a gift. And the way you get to trust is realizing that you're a walking miracle. You made it through this, and you made it through that, and you made it through this, and somehow you got through it. You had some kind of support from somewhere to make it through this. You're amazing. And when you get in touch with that, you're amazing. I mean, you can say I've been abandoned, but it doesn't affect you in the same way because you know you're amazing.
Dan here, host of the Wellness Warrior channel, Myth, Magic, and Medicine podcast. I'm taking a moment out to invite you to join me for the next live course in emotional healing, Beyond Anger, Reclaim Your Spirit, which is available in September 2025. The location is near the airport in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Heal stuck emotional patterns, reduce risks, and create the best version of you with this course. It's also a great fellowship of support and heartfelt stories and inner work. Online self-study for the Beyond Anger, Reclaim Your Spirit course begins in the fall of 2025. Visit www.warriorvox.com for more information.
So everything is amazing. Life is awesome. There is awe everywhere. I have a buddy who's writing a paper on original awe instead of original sin. And the idea that you can be just awed by all the good that there is around. If you start noticing all negative, all the negativity and all the hostility and all the rage and all the divisions and all the separation, then you're really looking at abandonment. Because once you start dividing everybody into you're this and I'm that, you're separating yourself off. And when you don't see the wholeness of it all, you've abandoned that other people, they've abandoned you, and everybody is focused on how they're different instead of how we're really one soul. Another key aspect of this process is a belief in scarcity. Scarcity leads to mistrust, and abundance leads to trust. If you think there's enough to go around and you start sharing it, then you can trust that it'll be okay. When people are hoarding and spending billions of dollars on themselves, let's say, in whatever way they're doing it, but there's millions of hungry people around, then how can you trust that everything is going to be okay? So my goal is to raise the consciousness to unity or oneness consciousness from empire, because the more people who do that, the more there will be a belief in abundance. So it's interesting how abandonment leads to scarcity, which leads to shame, which leads to division, which leads to hatred, which leads to violence. If we want to deal with violence, we have to look at where is your holistic holiness of a self? And how do you see the world? And do you see the world like that?
The whole strand of thread between violence and division and projection of separation on the outer world and the core abandonment somewhere in the self and the shame that's inside of that speaks a lot about our current, social pressure and what's happened to society. Like we talk about immigrants and the haves and the have-nots, the division, the hierarchies. It seems to be coming out of a deep wound.
It is out of a deep wound, and the problem that people have is they worship that wound or they live out that wound, believing it really was about them. But it wasn't about them. It was where the people were at who raised them, or the culture that they were thrown into. You're thrown into kindergarten with a whole bunch of other people who have all kinds of issues. Nobody helps you process any of that. You may have a teacher who hates you. Nobody helps you process that. You may have a teacher who's a bigot. And it's not just the teacher, it's the whole system, which creates a hierarchical, competitive, enemy kind of consciousness, like, you got to do better than them, or if they do better than you, then you're at the bottom, and I mean, all that hierarchical stuff is really toxic. Now, you can say, well, the survival of the fittest and all that. But that's only based on a scarcity idea that only certain people can survive. What if we all could survive? What if we helped each other survive and thrive?
But the system isn't set up, but the system does not seem to be oriented this way. One example of this idea of how people take their abandonment and turn it inside out is this validation seeking behavior. And we have a digital reality now where people who might feel invisible or unloved or live in that scarcity are seeking to prop themselves up through likes, through social media, through creating that. And the system rewards you. If you're weird enough, if you can draw people's attention by whatever means possible, you can not only get the validation, but you can also, it turns into economics. So there's an economy now of validation as well as not just as a behavior issue, but there's an actual dollar amount attached to that.
Thing is, it never fills the hole in your heart, so you have to do it more. If addictions worked, you'd only have to do it once, but you have to do it over and over again because it doesn't really solve the real issue, which is that I know who I am and I value what I am, and I know I'm loved, lovable, and loving, and that's me. Nobody can tell me anything different that will define me. So that it really is ultimately personal power. And when there's no personal power, there's always seeking power somewhere else. But it never works. Personal power is living an authentic life. And we have had numbers of people in power situations who have led authentic lives, who have been themselves. So it isn't, if you get into a system, that you have to lose it, but you have to be kind of careful about how you present it. And also, if you need praise, think about where you're not getting love, because we need to not need praise from the outside. We need to know that we're doing the best we can and we're enough. There's so many books on this, like Ruiz's book, The Four Agreements, is about this. David Rico's book, The Five Things We Cannot Change, is about this. Ann Wilson Schaef's book, When Society Becomes an Addict, is about this. Christopher Lash's book, The Culture of Narcissism. By the way, narcissism always comes from trying to overcompensate for abandonment. If I wasn't loved the way I needed to be and wasn't allowed to be my authentic self, the whole world revolves around me now because I got to get that because I never had that. So it's an overreaction to an internal emptiness. And the only way we can feel fulfilled and whole and holy is our consciousness, our minds, our beliefs, our heart. We have to change how we view the world and how we view ourselves and how we view abundance and how we view love and compassion. So when you have people who've lost their sense of their own worthiness, then they're always going to seek it on the outside. But the answer is it's an inside job. So seeking it on the outside is not going to solve. I'm aware that, Jimmy Carter, after he was president, did a whole lot of good stuff in the world because he wanted to. And he didn't just care whether people knew about it or not. He didn't do it for the publicity of it. And I'm just using him as just one example. I mean, there's Mother Teresa, there's St. Francis of Assisi. By the way, Richard Rohr and St. Francis of Assisi get all this idea of oneness consciousness and how you have to transcend individual differences and go, there is enough to go around. We have to figure out how to make that work, as opposed to, I want to take it from you and I'm going to destroy you. Because we have too much destruction going. The thing is, the destruction creates the scarcity. The scarcity creates the destruction. And it goes round and round and round, unless you have an intervention. And the intervention has to be internal, spiritual, emotional, and supportive from a certain number of people who will validate that you are worthy. And they do that by knowing that they are worthy. They have to feel worthy themselves. And so that's how it works. And that's why we have the world that we have. And there's a line in the Bible that says, and Jesus wept. And what that was about was grieving the sadness of everybody. There's two kinds of suffering. There's necessary suffering and unnecessary suffering. I got this from John Brantner, who was a professor at the University of Minnesota. And he said, necessary suffering happens to everybody. Unnecessary suffering is what we cause out of our own pain. And we cause so much unnecessary suffering. Think of all the children who are dying. And also, if we don't take care of the earth will not take care of us. And right now we have flooding in Texas that is just horrendous.
those two things are related, not taking care of the earth and losing our children, and policies that serve a hierarchical structure versus a collective unity is playing out in real time in front of us right now.
Yes. So how do we change and teach compassion and love to everyone? First of all, we have to really look honestly at our systems that are in place and challenge, well, why does there have to be grades and a curve that you get graded on? And why does there have to be the good papers get up on the board and the bad papers don't? Or, I mean, there's so many subtle and not so subtle ways that we lose our authenticity and our authentic selves. So you have to believe that we're basically good and loving. If you don't believe that, then you start out with a fear-based system, which is where we go back to mistrust. In any kind of fear-based system, there's always mistrust. In any love-based system, there's the opportunity for trust. Now, can you trust a person depends on how much inner work they've done, how they treat you, and what happens to people who've been abandoned is they're starved and they're easily taken in. So people who have been abandoned emotionally, people who've been neglected, people who've been hurt, people who have not gotten their emotional needs met, who've been told to shut up and stop crying because real boys don't cry, real men don't cry. I mean, all these messages that we get contribute to the kind of world we live in.
I'm really curious about the dupability of large segments of our society to sign up for what looks like on the very outside, mask, cruelty, hatred versus them. And what can we say about a population that looks at that and says, yeah, I'm in with that. I'm okay with that.
Well, I used to be very mad at Germany because they went along with Hitler and 6 million Jews were killed as a result of that. And I kept wondering, why didn't they do something? And I think when people are hurting, they're more gullible. They're more likely to follow someone who has some kind of charisma, or also they can identify with the wound of the person who's leading. And once they have a wound identification, it's like, oh, you really get me. You really understand me. Then they're willing to do anything for that person. It's a very addictive system, and it's very codependent. Melody Beatty is local in Minnesota, and she just passed not too long ago. But her books on codependency have to do with cultures, not just individual. So a whole group of people can be an addict, like Ann Wilson Schaaf said. Ann Wilson Schaaf and Melody Beatty were two of the most creative, insightful women that I've ever seen in terms of what they have created. Ann Wilson Schaaf wrote Living in Process. When you live in process, you also have to believe in abundance, that there's enough and it will be okay. Well, what people who a charismatic leader don't believe is that it will be okay unless you follow that leader, okay? So what happens is their spirituality gets sort of moved into another level of leader worship or wound connectedness. And until people do their inner work and their emotional work and their spiritual connection work, they're not ready to stand up to suffering and destruction. So we have people who are just not ready, and there's a lot. So this is what the whole men's movement was in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. The men's movement was to get men to move out of an empire consciousness into more of a oneness or a unity consciousness. That's what it was about, loving yourself, being compassionate, caring for others, helping the poor, helping those who don't have anything, that don't have a place to live. I mean, that was the movement. But you had to start with you, but you can't end with you. You have to start with you and then move to what is my purpose in the world to bring more love and light into the world. So having a real defined purpose is very, very significant, very important. And you get your real defined purpose by knowing who you are authentically. You don't have a real purpose unless you have that. You're working on that.
I have a sense that in kind of a cultish fashion, people who are following after would say misleadership or misgovernance or governance that's directed not necessarily in their interest, but in the interest of the hierarchical or whatever that is up there, whatever's going on, it's greed or power, that they do feel a sense of purposefulness. They are empowered. They're sort of like, if their spirit's empty and abandoned and hurting, but they have found meaning and structure and certainty in this thing. And it seems very hard to get people off of that, because what are they faced with? Facing accountability for their life or for their pain? Who wants to do that?
That's right. It takes work and it takes courage to deal with the idea that you, in many ways, were abandoned, but you made it through and you're a miracle. Therefore, the abandonment wasn't about you. See, it hooks into the narcissism of the leadership and then the narcissism of the crowd of people. Because once you realize that it wasn't ever about you, you're free. Until you realize that, you're not free. And you believe in a quick fix, too. It's like, I remember somebody saying, I'm going to end the war in one day. I remember somebody said that, about one day and it will be over. And it's like, but the complexity is it's an empire system that they're dealing with. And I believe that comes from trauma and trauma pain and trauma consciousness, which is early on, historically, a lot of people have been displaced and abused and killed because of a belief in fear and scarcity. There's not enough to go around. I'm going to take yours. And as long as you have a scarcity belief and you have a worthlessness belief, you want a quick fix. So what I think is, get rid of all 6 million Jews, our economy will get better. It's like, really?
Get rid of the immigrants, your problems will go away.
That's right.
All them dog and cat eating, gangsters who are invading our borders, right? Which is ridiculous.
And the other thing is generalizing, like they're all drug addicts anyway, and they're all bringing drugs, and that's not true. There may be a few people or some people in that group who are doing that, but to say an entire group is doing that is blaming and shaming and also controlling. There's a lot of need when people are hurting, to control outcomes. I want this to happen and I'm going to control that. I'm going to make this happen the way I want it to happen. And very often there's no trust in that. There's no trust in that really, because it doesn't work that way. You have to have positive outcomes, and then you can trust that the process will work. But right now it's a fear-based process.
Within that issue is a lot of betrayal. Going back to betrayal, the relationship between fear and loss of trust and the breakdown and abandonment and betrayal, there's a connection, right? A lot of people are betrayed. You see this betrayal happening politically within the people who supported something. They're let down, they're disappointed. Kind of everyone's in for a shit show.
Well, people are losing their jobs. They're finding that things are more expensive instead of less expensive. Basically, the whole system of empire is based on denial and lying, okay? I said that in my first talk, too. There's always a denial and lying. Therefore, there's always betrayal. And when your parents tell you, you need to do this and this and this, and we're sending you to this place, and we haven't researched anything about it, we don't know who you're going to be interacting with, but we love you anyway. There's a confusion in the brain of the child. Like, why are you doing this to me? I had to go back to school every day for 7 years to bullying. We tried to stop it. My parents did call the school and they said, well, he has to toughen up. It's like, what?
Sending you back into the battle zone feels like betrayal, right?
Right. And that's what happens to many kids. I mean, if you look at even girl bullying is about hierarchy. Well, just let that go.
So what is the solution for abandonment and betrayal in your view, to restate the case?
Okay. The solution is to change the consciousness and to move to a higher level or a different level of how we see the world, how we see ourselves, how we see each other. And that was the whole purpose of the Jesus message. Now, the theme is that he got crucified for that message because people don't want to hear somehow that there's work to be done spiritually and emotionally and really get at what is really going on. Because empires are great at hiding what is really going on. And so the kid goes, there's a disconnect here. I mean, I'm being told this, but what I'm seeing is that. And so you go crazy a little bit, like, what is this? And that's a betrayal too, because you're not getting the truth about who you are. And his message is that you are loved, lovable, and loving. That is the message. And go and sin no more, sit and tell the truth. Live in integrity, according to Ruiz, is the first agreement. You live in integrity. Another word that we haven't used much today is accountability. Now, it's very important that people take responsibility for things that they do and look carefully at the effects of their behavior in a complex way. because every time you do something, it affects the environment. And we just went through the 4th of July, and I was thinking about how much fireworks we had. And what does that do to the environment? Does it have any effect or not? Why do we have to have fireworks on the 4th of July? First of all, we're not really a government of the people. I mean, we're not. The whole idea of what America is has to be looked at. Is it an empire also, even though they wanted to escape from an empire? Very often what happens is people who want to escape from an empire create their own empire because that's what they know. I'm moving from the bottom to the top, but I'm not changing it that it's an empire.
Sowing the seeds of empire consciousness to the next generation. Right. And I feel like with all that you're saying, there's a stark truth that we have to face. And that is, if we're going to actually heal this dynamic within us, within our culture, within our systems, we're going to have to stop going for the low hanging fruit and what's easy and what seems to solve the solution, and have a universal agreement that whatever seems to be too easy to solve a complex problem isn't the right answer. And that it tends to take us into shadow and into negative outcomes. So we need like a roll up your sleeves movement where everyone agrees that all the work that is important and vital is going to take some work that we have to get and commit to inside of ourselves and to support each other doing that.
Here's what I want to say about that, because that's very important. We know why boys are suffering. We've known for 50 years why boys are suffering. We just don't do anything about it. There's enough wisdom out there of what needs to change and how people need to put in the effort to change it. We know this, but it isn't happening. Not enough.
Thank you, listener and viewer, for tuning in to this episode of Myth, Magic, and Medicine podcast on the Wellness Warrior channel. Please like, subscribe, and share this video. And if you'd like to buy me a cup of coffee or offer any other support or comments, please go to Wellness Warrior on Patreon. To enroll in the next transformational course for online or in-person learning, or to connect with Dan and learn about the Warrior coaching offer, please visit www.warriorvox.com. Thank you, and blessings of light, learning, and good health.